Yeah. Hi, hello, and welcome to the library. Hopefully everything is working. Hopefully you can hear me. I hope that you are doing all right. Hi, Sky. Hi, Secret. Hi, Rani. Hi, Ellie. It is indeed me yapping. Audio is good, perfect. Then we can start. Well, today is a science communication, journal reading stream. I wanted to do something else than like working on the video essay. So I was like, maybe we should go back to food study a little bit. And I was thinking that this was an interesting topic, both for me and for the stream. You hope that I'm doing well. I am doing well indeed. I had a very good night, actually. It was kind of like split in two, but I slept a lot and I think it was pretty good. I was a little bit unproductive this morning, but I think it's also all right. I will eat the stream topic. Well, you know, we are here to do that. Like, I really, really, really like food studies. I really like talking about food. So I think it's a great way, you know, to create some discussion on the stream. We'll probably do some also like dolls afterwards, like the, you know, the food dolls that we did last time. I think it was pretty silly and pretty funny. So we might do that as a treat, after we are done with reading this pretty long, well, maybe not that long chapter, but it is like 10 pages long, I think. It's written pretty small, so I'll try to, read some sections a bit faster than the others. But yeah, we should be here for a little while. I hope you don't get concrete like I did. I mean, I saw like the picture that like you sent, and I shouldn't be surprised that like most food that we see doesn't look like edible. But this was saddening. Poodles was peak. Yeah. We'll do that later. I mean, I could do that right now, but I think I want us to be a little bit productive before we do that. So, without further ado, unless like I have like, do I have like some things to talk about before we start? I don't think I do. I was kind of like tapped out of like current events during this weekend, so I don't even know like what happened in general. Yes, there was the launch of the flyby mission Artemis 2. So we know like that it is like the first crew mission that is going like to the moon and also like past the low orbit of the Earth since the Apollo programs. So I saw a lot of people being very interested in that. And you know what? Good for them. I will be honest. I think my wonder, like kind of like childlike wonder for space has kind of like dissipated a little bit compared to when I was like a child. So I just like nodded politely at the launch of like Artemis 2, but good for you if like you enjoy that. Well, there's still like the Middle Eastern crisis, but it is what it is. And I've seen an article earlier this morning. Let me put that in here. This morning of like the Mainichi talking about Japan arranging talks with Iran leader as Middle East tension grows. I think it's like an interesting like shift diplomatically, because like Takaichi feels probably like cornered by her, US leanings, and she probably wants to take some steps to kind of like get away from the US to some extent. You remember perhaps that like Iran also sent a message to Japan saying that they would be very happy to talk to them on the sides to like let some of their boats pass the Hormuz Strait. Japan kind of like declined politely, saying that like they did not intend to file any, I don't know, contract or just agreement to let like their ship pass the strait. But I think like we are seeing that like everybody is kind of like doing things without the US in this situation. You might have seen also, we can like check that quickly, Gulf country peace without US. Can I like see an article? Kind of like that, I think. There was like a set of like countries, I can't remember who exactly in the Gulf, that were like meeting, Arab states were meeting without the US. That was the very interesting thing. The US was not part of like this kind of like council, and it kind of like shows that there is obviously a very real weakening of like US presence in the region, obviously, and that they are literally burning all their diplomatic like credit for the next decades. I think like this is also a very interesting article. We won't read that together because I think it's like a bit too long for us. But I think it's a pretty interesting article if you want to kind of like have like a primer on the role of Israel in this conflict. So feel free to read it on your own. I miss having space wonder. It sounds fun. It is. I think also maybe it's like a very personal problem, but you get into university, you get into like advanced topics and stuff, and I think like some of like the wonder of like topics that you had like that you enjoyed as a child, they kind of like disappear. And hi, Bernard. I can't wait for the Zodiac fight once we land on the moon. Hopefully, we won't have to fight Zodiac. Insider Trading Way is gonna have a dinner party with a Zodiac fight, I believe. Crazy work, crazy work. Okay, so that's basically for international news. Weapons manufacturing is so poggies. Oh my god, this is crazy work. What are we reading in this chat? The advanced topics like Advanced War 2. It has been a long time since I played Advanced Wars, to be fair. Okay, so what I wanted to say is that today we are reading an article, a contribution in, let me show you the cover of the book. So this is like an author that I like a lot, Michelle T. King. She writes about like food studies in the Chinese, well, kind of like Sinotic world. She also talks about like Taiwan and so on. And she's someone that I like a lot because she talks about like food studies by always linking that to very specific like very lived experiences. She links that to like people, to culture, to very broad like anthropologic ideas, and I think it makes like cooking way more interesting to study because you do understand that like there is nothing like an authentic dish, right? Everything is very dynamic, and I think it's very much what we find in her writings. And this is her more like academic book, Culinary Nationalism in Asia, that she edited with like many other, well, there were like a lot of contributors in this book. And we'll take a look at one of these articles today, one of these chapters, which is this one. So Vegetarian Nationalism, Critiques of Meat Eating for Japanese Bodies in Japan between 1880 and 1938. So what is very interesting in here for us, I believe, is that like you might remember that I wanted to do a series on food history in Japan at some point. It's still like something I want to do, but maybe when I have like a little bit more time and stuff. But I wanted to talk about what was very interesting to me was talking about like meat after the war. And how like the consumption of meat like grew exponentially after the war through the introduction of the reintroduction of meat by American soldiers that were here in Japan during the occupation. And if there is this idea of like eating meat anew, it meant that there was for a little while a period where Japan was not consuming meat. And I think like this is a very good primer chapter to kind of like talk about this idea of like what is a vegetarian diet for Japanese at that time. And one idea that we might have very like naively is to link like vegetarianism to Buddhism, which is not wrong, right? We know that in Buddhism, you should not like eat animal products or flesh. Well, mostly flesh. But what is very interesting is that like it was not the only motor for vegetarianism. And one example is nationalism that kind of like weaponized the consumption, well, the non-consumption of meat as like part of a national identity and stuff. And I think that's like very interesting because it sheds a very different light on what we kind of have in mind when we think of Japanese diet. It took me a while to realize that cuisine is flow and history. Yeah, I think it's like unless like you get really into food culture, we often have this idea of very compartmentalized like cuisines around the world, and it's not immediately obvious that cuisine is, of course, cooking is, of course, a result of like anthropological and cultural like interactions and hybridations. But the moment I think you see it, it starts to make a lot of sense. I think one of the issue is this idea of like fusion cuisine, which has been, you know, a very trendy term lately in the past decades, mixing like one culture with another. But in some ways, like fusion cuisine, I think for a lot of people have a very negative implications. It's like, oh, it's like mixing, I don't know, American cuisine with like something else. And there's this loss of like authenticity. When you think of like, I don't know, American style pizza, for example, it feels like for some people like an offense to, you know, more quote unquote traditional Napolitan or Roman like pizza. And it's also linked, I think, to a very like almost bourgeois cuisine, this idea of like fusion, like high dining and stuff. But when we look like closer to interactions, we understand like everything is a fusion cuisine in a way, because like you will take from literally everything around you to make some new dishes, and cuisine is of course like influenced by environment. So we see like high connections between like type of like cuisines and also like environmental changes, climate change, and so on. That's why like I wanted to do also like a lecture on cuisine after like catastrophe, for example, like Fukushima, and how like there is this sense of loss of culinary identity being like forced outside of, you know, the region where you have grown up, but also like how it can renew itself by using like certain techniques with like new products in the new regions where, you know, certain population have been transferred to. And hi, I hope that you have a wonderful day right now, Hishi. Okay, I've been yapping enough as an introduction, so let's get started. So vegetarianism in Japan. I don't know if the music is like a little bit loud. I don't think it is. Okay, so many Western vegetarians express feelings of frustration at the lack of meat-free options in Japan, with vegans finding it almost impossible, sorry, I will kind of like zoom, impossible to eat out in a country where the meals are saturated with animal-driven ingredients and the natives appear to have few moral qualms about serving and consuming animal flesh. So again, I think like one just like quick thing to notice here is really like this idea of eating out, right? Just because in my opinion, like there is a big gap between like what people are eating outside and what they're eating at home, especially in Japan. As much as like you have this idea of like eating like ramen because it's like a very like quick thing to eat and it's pretty comforting, we should not expect like people to eat that way at home every day. And we do experience that in our own like countries, right? About how to some extent you will always eat a bit more unhealthy outside compared to what you would cook at home, on average. Although like you need like to kind of like assess the situation against like, you know, social economic positions in society and stuff. But that's like what is very interesting to me. It's not that like consumption of meat is like over the top in Japan, like overall, is that like when you eat outside, it is difficult to eat meat, to not eat meat. And I think it creates also like false ideas about like a certain cuisine to some extent. But I do agree that like, you know, finding like a non-meat option outside in Japan is indeed like complicated. So you have like quotes, we don't have to read that. Okay, such dismay can turn to bafflement when Westerners, upon learning that the Japanese used to be predominantly vegetarian. For centuries, the country forbade the slaughter and consumption of domesticated animals until the Meiji era. So very much like under Buddhist influence, right? Game and fish had continued to be eaten, but made up a small proportion of the overall diet. As in other parts of the world, religion, in this case Buddhism, is said to have played a role in Japan's development of a taboo surrounding the killing of such animals as cattle. So when they say that it's like a small proportion of the overall diet, it's just because of chains of logistics, right? It's a bit more complicated to have access to game and to fish at a time where you did not have like logistic circuits that would allow villagers, for example, to have access to those. And fishing is like an entire activity in itself. And in some parts of like the country, especially if you were like inland, if we talk about, for example, like, I don't know, Edo period, and you were not like near a river necessarily, or not like near the coast, fish would be like a bit more difficult to access. However, the ruling elites realized following visits to the United States and Europe in the 1860s and 70s that advanced nations tended to eat a lot more meat and dairy. And for this reason, the state made concerted effort to promote the consumption of ingredients derived from livestock, in particular beef and milk. Since then, it has appeared that Japan has given up on his predominantly vegetarian ways. Of course, you know that like this period here is very much like the opening of the country to the West. With like, you know, the Meiji era, the entering the Meiji era, you had people coming to Japan, Westerners coming to Japan with certain like knowledge, culture, or cultural ideas, and in return you had Japanese people going to the United States and Europe in this trend of like modernization through Westernization. And that's when like you have those like cultural exchanges and this discovery of like meat to a certain extent. In the Edo period, I have to imagine more inland folks would have seen fish more as fertilizers. I will be honest, like this is a topic that is very interesting to me, but I don't have like any quantitative data to kind of like back that up. There is, let me just show you the book, but I don't remember like anything about that in here. I think the book is called, So you have this very interesting book by Roderick I. Wilson called Turbulent Streams, An Environmental History of Japan's River. Well, basically during the Edo period and until the start of like the Showa era. And this is like a very interesting like book because it talks about like rivers in Japan, and especially the relationship between the environment, the fauna, and also the people living around the river, be it like villages, also like the local authorities or central authorities that are regulating behaviors around rivers. And Roderick Wilson talks about like riparian relations as like this very complex net of relationships between all those like different actors. But I can't remember exactly if in this book he's talking about the relationship to fish in general. Maybe in here, like rural, like river pods, but I just can't remember like exactly, to be honest. There was like a lot about like planning and like urban planning or public planning, but a bit less when it came to relationship to like fish per se, I think. There was also this, well, let me take the script of like the video essay that I made. There was that's crazy. You can see like the backstages of the video. Yes, that's this particular thingy. You had like this publication on of the Obayashi Quarterly on fish culture. And it's true that like you had like fish as an offering, and I think both like as an offering to like divinities, but also an offering to the central power, right? Especially the isle in Edo, you had like certain like fisheries that were officially mandated by the power, by the shogun, to like supply the shogun with fish, and that was like their kind of like honor to do so. And you had like certain like fish that were known to be like common offerings to the shogun. But again, I think in this article you still have this idea that like fish was still like something that was part of like people's diet. The kind of like problem that we have here is that like most of the impressions that we have come from literary texts, and there is always, when you kind of like examine like those very ancient like periods, you have like a gap between, you know, what kind of like scholarly people will tell you in like literary text, in here the Manyosho, and what is the actual behavior of people in their everyday life. And when I graduated, so my topic of research when I was like in my master's was ancient history and the role of literature in memory strategies for women, basically. So the idea was to kind of like see how women would use literature as a way to preserve memory or to create some memory for themselves and kind of like transmit that to the future. But the problem is that like, because in the ancient period in Greece, we have like such a limited pool of like text when it comes to woman writing, be it like literary text or inscriptions on you know, tombstones and all, it's very difficult to make the leap and the demonstration that like what we see in those texts, in those inscriptions, is a good representation of what happened in reality. So my approach with my thesis was to say that like there were like possibilities, there were like a field of like possibilities that women could investigate to kind of like create their own memory, but I do not have like enough evidence, quantitatively speaking, to make a generalization to the entirety of the population. And I think, especially when it comes to behavior and to mental like dispositions, mindsets, it's always very hard to reconstitute the actual shape of like what people were actually thinking. I'm trying to find my sources for this, but a large population of fish catched ended up as fertilizer. Tokugawa peasants win, lose, or draw mentions it, but doesn't quote numbers. I think it's kind of like the problem, right? It's like, in a very quantitative sense, it's very difficult to have like a good idea. Let me just do this just to log in. Doo-doo-dum. Oh. Can I just log into Gstore, please? I mean, we indeed. Well, let me just like pass the article like very quickly. Yeah, this is really this idea of like mentalité, right? Disorder and stuff. Directly on agriculture. I'll wait because like I want us to do other things, so I'll just pass for fish. Deprive older and betterable plot of green fertilizer by diverting it to new fields. That green fertilizer grew scarce, more burdensome, and expensive to obtain. Its provisioning less dependable. Substitution became necessary and possible. By the mid-18th century, for example, fish caught off Tohoku were being brought to shore, unloaded, dried, boiled, reloaded abroad. Coasting vessels, ships south to Choshi, transferred to riverboats, hauled up to the Tone to its south fork, sent to Edo, Okay, so we, as you said, like we have like we don't have any like quantities here. I don't see like any quotes either. And we can see also that like we're already like, you know, a century after the start of like the Edo era. At this time, you had like the public like work on the Tone. I think the Tone has been already diverted at that time, if my memory is correct. I think like it ended in like early 19th century, or am I mistaken? I can't remember when like the, I think it's also in here. The shifting, okay. I think there are like maps. Okay, so I think like the diverting of like the Tony River was like done quite early. You can see that we are already like in 16. By 1660, we already had like the Tone diverting like to the east. But we don't know like further like to the east how the situation was on like this map. But we're already like at a late period, meaning that part of like the Tohoku, part of like the region surrounding like Edo were already kind of like drained. And that's why like you had this substitution of like grain fertilizer to like, you know, fish fertilizer. I think the problem here is that like we don't know the ratio of like different types of fertilizer. I'm trying to The gist of this article is that the current literature on Tokugawa peasants doesn't take into account environmental history, my new focus. Yeah. And I think like that's why I think like this particular book is very interesting, because it kind of like gives a very good like foray into environmental history as like a social history, and help us have like a better idea of like how you have like this idea of like governing regions where you have like a lot of rivers, and also like how people like behaved around rivers. And I think you have like a lot of articles that are, for example, talking about like how much people use like rivers for transportation and to go like up and down, you know, the stream. And I think like you had really like those two different like parts, here being a more like mentality history, while this one was a more like engineering topic, although like both kind of like blends together, because of course mentality are kind of also engineered by the government bodies, the governing bodies that are giving like rules to like about like how people should behave around rivers, like installing, I don't know, like limits for catching fish and so on. And we know when it comes like to the Tohoku, we had like this very like long program of like diverting rivers and stuff to kind of like fight flooding, to drain also the terrain, and that modified like how people would interact with their land. So yeah, you have also this, when we talk about like environmental history and people, you have where is it? You have here the work by Arne Kalland. So anthropologist on Japanese history, on Japanese like culture, and especially when it comes to fishing. And he wrote like a lot of very interesting things. I don't know if I have it right here right now. Let me check like I think I should have like the books. Yeah, so you have like, I think you have this book that is like kind of like talking about like fishing through a slightly like environmental aspect. Maybe not this one. I think it might be like the other one, because it's like a more. Oh, I don't have this one. So I don't have this one for some reason. But this book here, let me zoom a little bit more. This book here on Shingo is really about like a very specific village. So you have a very like close analysis of the village and like its surrounding like environment. And I think it is like a very good example of like this shift towards a like more environmentally like focused social history. Okay, so we are really not reading like quick here. So there was this idea, as we said, of ruling elites going to the West to kind of like get some knowledge from, you know, Westerners. Very good. Scholars of Japanese food history have made very little mention of vegetarianism, with the current literature leaving the impression that people in the modern era showed no significant interest in either its principles or its practices. One major reason for this oversight, which the chapter seeks to rectify, has been the overt focus on the rise of meat eating as an integral part of the country's modernization process. And I will be honest, that was kind of like the point that I wanted to make when it came to post-war consumption of like meat. Even since the Emperor Meiji was presented by the state as a regular consumer of beef and mutton, The dominant narrative has been to chart the almost inexorable rise of food derived from animals. Leading intellectuals of the late 19th century, such as Fukuzawa Yukuchi, contributed to this narrative by equating the larger physique of Westerners with their meat-based diet. Experts also proclaimed that animal-derived food were nutritionally superior because meat and dairy contain greater amounts of protein than the typical indigenous fare that relied mainly on plant-based sources of energy. Kind of like what this article was saying here, right? Pound for pound, fish meal is much more nutritious than mulch and amenable to more precise management. Pointing to Western nutritional science, they argued that meat was not only essential to growth, health, and strength, but it was also a significant source of intellectual and moral capacity. And you have like this this idea, right, of a moral superiority of like the West for a lot of Japanese people at that time, a lot of people in the elite circles. And it's always like a very complicated topic because you see like this trend of like modernization and of westernization in every part of like Japanese culture at that time, be it like food, be it like political government, be it like literature, journalism, and so on. And you have like, it's very easy to equate both for people at that time and for us nowadays that like modernity is something Western, and that keeping like old traditions or only staying with old traditions, old Japanese traditions, was kind of like a regression, or at least like it meant not being open to more provocative ideas for progress. And this is also like a trend that we kind of like need to fight, right? Both like when we think about like people in the past and about like our methodology when we are trying to study like history of this period, because you had like trend of modernization that were not necessarily like Western, or at least completely Western. If we talk about like I don't know, literature, you had like writers that were very conscious about like certain trends of like Western writing, and the rise of like, you know, the novel in the West at that time. But they kind of like use that with their own twist. And I think that's like what you will see, for example, with authors like Jumpo Edogawa, who was like as much inspired by Western writers in his way of like, in the style, it's very like Poe-esque, it's very like reminiscent of Sherlock Holmes, but you had like very specific streaks of like psychological exploration that were Japanese. And I think it's very important to understand that like modernity can also arise from like Japanese culture without like having to rely completely on like Western culture. So this discourse of like moral like superiority of the West is something that we find like a lot in sources, but that's always something that we need to kind of like weight against like other elements to not like fall into like a very like ideological trap. Western superiority only in aptly named legs +2. So consuming meat was thus often part of becoming civilized, enlightened, and modern, thereby helping the nation to become stronger and more capable of rubbing shoulders with the advanced West. The establishment of countless eateries serving beef stew, gyunabe, helped popularize the taste of meat to such an extent that Harada Nobuo, the leading historian on the subject, has estimated that the country had become a nation of unapologetic meat eater by the 1980s. Okay. Existing research has thus tended to reproduce the powerful discourse of meat eating without questioning its force. It has assumed that debates about the desirability of a meat-based society, with a few objections by Buddhists in the 1870s, had already been won in the late 19th century. It has implied that the foundation for the boom in the consumption of meat and dairy after the Second World War had already been laid in the Meiji era. And it has struggled to account for the sluggish uptake of meat eating during the Taishō and the early Showa periods. Focusing on the lively debates on vegetarianism that took place between the start of the 19th century, the 20th century, and 38, this chapter provides a corrective to this meat-affirming narrative. It argues that there were significant and sustained scientific doubts expressed about the merit of a meat-based society. And you can see here a very interesting thing, this idea of like sustained scientific doubts, meaning like fighting kind of like the West on its own territory, right? The territory of science, quote unquote, with Japanese people kind of like going against like this narrative. Umami coming in clutch. There is a very... Where did I read that? I can't remember when exactly. About like the kind of like importance of like soy sauce in Japanese culture versus, you know, our like meat broth in Western culture. Although, again, like we say that, but the basis also for flavors in like Western culture is also like olive oil and cream and butter a lot, so non-animal product. Well, or at least, you know, not coming from the flesh of the animals. Okay, so it shows how these debates sparked ideas about the superiority of the Japanese diet, the uniqueness of the Japanese stomach, the richness of indigenous vegetarian meals, and the sophistication of Japanese culinary techniques. It demonstrates how the construction of this vegetarian nationalism meant that Japan could boast that it had little to learn from the West on how to prepare its vegetarian dishes. And it illustrates the striking similarities and differences between Japan and China, as the latter witnessed an ultimately unsuccessful state-led attempt to advance vegetarian nationalism around the same period. While socialists attempted to introduce Western-style vegetarianism to Japan, this chapter shows how the fortunes proved faithful as the government clamped down on the left-wing movement, resulting in a very different understanding of vegetarianism to the Western variant. And that's still something, by the way, that you will see today. Like what you will see today when it comes to like being vegetarian is that like in Japan, it's completely okay to include, for example, like fish in your vegetarian diet. It's still the case. It's changing, I think, because of like the influence of the West. But I think because of this like kind of like national vegetarianism or vegetarian nationalism, you have like very specific ideas that we don't like necessarily find in the West. Like people would not call themselves like vegetarian if they still like consume fish, in my opinion. Like you will be a pescatarian or like a kind of like flexitarian that is just like being kind of like aware of like, you know, the cost of like eating like animal flesh, and you're kind of like trying to reduce that. And I think it's very interesting because you have like this blend of like kind of like ethical ideas about like not killing animals, but also ideas of like health benefits by still, you know, eating fish that are rich in proteins and rich in like omega-3 and so on. And there's always like when it comes to like history of diet, a lot of very different like factors that are coming into play to kind of like justify very, you know, specific like behaviors. Okay, but first, toward a meat-based society. So one of the first intellectual heavyweights responsible for equating meat with modernity was Fukuzawa Yukichi. During his trip to the United States and Europe, the founder of the Keio University was struck by the amount of meat Westerners consumed. In the pamphlet on eating meat, Nikushoku no Setsu, published in 1870, Fukuzawa specifically criticized Japan's traditional diet that had for centuries privileged the consumption of grains and plants. In his view, this explained why his countrymen were in poor health and weak. So he took aim at the taboo that considered the act of eating meat and drinking milk as barbaric, pointing to the hypocrisy of those who ate whale. And by the way, when we talk about that, there's something very, very interesting about whale culture, right, in Japan, whale fishing. It's such a big part, I think, of like Japanese society, that it's very hard to push the idea of like banning whale fishing even today. You may have heard about the famous documentary. I'm trying to not like show you the pictures because it's kind of like no, I won't have it in here then. Okay, but like what, like, because here we had like a lot of like Western documentaries, and we know that in the West, like the idea of like fishing whales is kind of very controversial and very poorly viewed in general. But in Japan, it's the contrary. You had like documentaries that were like for the for continuing like whale fishing, and one of them was very successful. I think it was named like Whale, but I can't remember exactly. And this is actually like an ongoing debate. I mean, like, you know, whale fishing in Japan. The insatiable craving for the consumption of all life until none remains. That's what, you know, the sky is saying. So be aware of yourself. The sky is angry and hungry as well. Despite the popular perception that meat was polluting, Fukuzawa argued that the very fish that people ate could be found feeding on corpses and excrement in the seas and rivers in which they were caught. In contrast, the meat derived from cattle and sheep, because they were herbivorous, could be considered much cleaner. He explained that beef and dairy could provide a great deal of nourishment since they constituted the basic ingredients in Western diet. He encouraged his countrymen to embrace them. His argument, which was based on the Western sense of nutrition, became a major point of reference in future debates about the relative merits of meat-based and plant-based diets. It also laid the foundation of a meat-vegetable dichotomy and contributed to the popular and erroneous impression that all Westerners were voracious meat eaters. And I think that it's this particular dichotomy is still like something we are struggling with like nowadays, right? Especially because like we know that the consumption of like meat is like a political topic, a very like heated political topic nowadays. And you will see a lot of people that are very much like in one side or the other, with like a very like strict dichotomy, because we have like ideas like, you know, activists like purity and stuff when it comes to like eating or not like animal flesh or animal products. And this dichotomy, I think, like is like one of the core problems in those very heated debates, because we don't see like consumption and diets as like a more granular spectrum. Like we know, for example, and you kind of like know that probably, you might know this particular graph here. Well, okay, it's a little bit blurry, but where you had like, you have this it represents like how much like carbon dioxide is released per gram of protein of a certain, you know, animal products. And we can see that there are like animals that are consuming or at least emitting the production like of this particular like meat protein is producing a lot of pollution. And we know it has been like documented like a lot that like beef, especially, and mutton to some extent, are extremely polluting in general without even like taking into account the chain of logistics to kind of like transport like the meat to one place to another. And I think it's like a very interesting like point in the debate in the whole like should you eat meat or should you not eat meat, is that at the very least, even if you still want to eat meat, you can choose like better meat that is less polluting than beef. And of course it doesn't like, that's a very like environmental like idea, but we need to like combine that to like ethical ideas and stuff. You know, where are you sourcing your meat? When has your meat been like, you know, raised with animals like on an open field, or was it like in a factory and stuff? But I think like even as a very individual like level, there are choices that are kind of like easy to make. Like on a very personal like standpoint, I don't imagine myself becoming vegan, for example, because I would not be able to remove cheese from my diet, in my opinion. But it doesn't mean that like I cannot like make choices to reduce at least my consumption of beef, right? And go for like other animal proteins that are less polluting. Humans are the barbaric space orcs +2. Everything is food and food is political. Indeed. Beef is also huge in methane compared to other meats. Exactly. So you have like this very like broad pollution when it comes to more granular consumption choices, and I think that it is like an actionable like element to kind of like balance your overall like pollution, your overall like carbon footprint, without like completely becoming, you know, vegetarian or vegan if like this is a little bit too much for you. Being vegan becomes a bit backwards when it comes to honey and sheep shearing, for example. Exactly. I think, again, if you want to be vegan, there's no problem, but we still need, I think, to kind of like link that to like you should not like become like, in my opinion, a vegan just like to become a vegan. It has also to be rooted in like you know, actual political action, in the sense that like you link your consumption of like food to very like specific like issues that you can back up, and then you can do whatever you want. Like if you are a vegan, like nobody will tell you to not be vegan. But I think that like, because we have like such an interconnected society nowadays, with like animal products that are used and reused in like a lot more different fields, there is obviously to some extent an amount of like, you know, unavoidable pollution, unavoidable like ethic issues that you will encounter on your way. And more than like activist purity, it's more like how, for you as like an individual, you believe that like you can like reach a state where you're happy about like the model that you're proposing for yourself to the others. And of course, like we're talking about like individual choices, but like we should obviously talk about like more political choices at a higher level, where ideas like funding specific parts of the industry is problematic, because we have like state money that is going to like very polluting industries and agricultural facilities, when they could go like for something more, you know, to fund, I don't know, like shorter circuits and more local like food, for example. As far as I'm concerned, and I am admittedly pretty ignorant on the topic, there could be a case to be made for the consumption of meat so long as it's done in harmony with the environment. That's just not really feasible with the model of society we have right now. Yes, I think it's like a very interesting, right? Because you have societies where like, I mean, meat was always consumed for a very long time, right? It's just that the consumption of meat at that point was not problematic outside of like ethical like considerations, because it was not polluting, right? And you had like a kind of like symbiotic relationships between, to some extent, between like animals and humans. I think like it starts to be complicated in a more capitalistic environment, as you were saying, because it brings like new questions about like being like productive in terms of like, you know, having enough cattle to feed like an entire group of people and stuff. And that's when you start to have like policies that are really going in an abstract direction and a very animal like ignoring direction. And that's when you have like those ethical problems that are compounding. And I'm not saying that, you know, that we should not like consider like those ethical problems when it comes to like eating animal flesh or animal product. I think there's like an entire problem nowadays of humans being very, you know, intuitively put at the top of the food chain, when we are only, you know, one animal amongst the others on Earth. And there are like a lot of issues here, you know, beyond like environmental like issues that we need to solve, and there's no like good solutions, I believe. In my opinion, like the role of the government is really to kind of like at least deal with like the environmental issues and to kind of like ask the ethical questions. I don't think that the government is able to kind of like regulate on ethical issues, but that's like my philosophical like position. But government should be able like to kind of ask this question to citizens, telling them, are you fine or not with this, and how do you want to like construct like your society, your local like society model to fit your own like ethical beliefs. And in that sense, I think that we are going in the future at some point towards like a decentralization of like those like logistical chains to go into like shorter circuits where we can have like at, you know, a citizen level some influence on like the food that we are consuming. Being vegan is fine, but it's another story to advocate for veganism on a societal scale, because it is always like it will start to have like, I'm not saying that like people should not like become vegan. Like I genuinely believe that like it's a nice direction to at least like go towards. But then, and that's like kind of like what we say here is that you will start to get into political ideas and with like nationalism like in the background, because we're talking about like nationalism and vegetarianism in Japan, but this is the case in India, right? Where like if you are not like if you are part of like the Hindi group, the Hindi cultural group, you will be like a vegetarian, or at least you will trend towards vegetarianism. And we know that like it's a big talking point for like the actual like far right in India right now. So there's always like a problem when it comes to, as you say, like at the state level advocating for, you know, a very specific like consumption, instead of like opening possibilities and letting like people like choose for themselves, and kind of like educating people into like choosing what feels like the best, you know, on an environmental, on like an ethical standpoint. But that's the role of school, to kind of like teach young people those like options and let them decide for themselves. My main issue with this framing is that it's taking a systematic issue and giving it an individual solution, which just doesn't work. Exactly. It should, like, in my opinion, be closer to like founding like specific like activities where we know that, for example, like, you know, the factories where chicken are kind of like just like put on top of each other and in like inhuman or just terrible conditions, that's like something that we should like regulate against, right? But this is very different from like banning completely like a certain type of like food from like a diet nationwide. Shut off your shower when you're using your soap to save water. Yeah, okay. We do agree, of course. Yeah, problems are systematic and need to be solved at a systematic level, yes. Also, in my somewhat experienced opinion, I think basing one's agriculture on being vegan makes it next to impossible to create a permanent farm environment without having to bow down to additive nutrients or shipping in new fertile soil, introducing animals for pest control, manure, and or butchery side products is far more viable in terms of being environmentally friendly. Yeah, and I think that's what you see like when you check like more ancient like there are still like farms like that, of course, but like when you check like ancient farms and stuff that were more at, you know, a familial level without like this super concentration of like land, you have this thing of like a symbiosis between like animals and human and the flora. That is like working very well, as you say. And it's true that like we have seen like in those like industrial like farms, disparition of this very like natural or natural-ish symbiosis between different actors, replacing like animals by, you know, external like pollutants or machinery. Whereas, I don't know, we have seen, especially in Japan, that like reintroducing like animals like in rice paddies was actually very beneficial because they would like take care of any insects that would be problematic for the rice, and they would also serve as like fertilizers with their feces for the entire like rice paddies. I recently did a survey thing about electricity spending and environmental impact, and most of my carbon dioxide tonnage contribution came from sources that I had no control over, even though I'm broke and barely eat food. I think it's kind of like the problem is that you are stuck like in a very like systematic and a very like the broader like environment that is like making choices like for you. And I think it's kind of like the problem in nowadays society, especially for our westernized or you know, urbanized like lifestyle, is that most of like what you do has basically no impact on the environment. You are confronted with choices where you cannot actually choose the option that like you want to do. There are like certain things that we can change, of course. I think that like the rise of like solar panels is a very interesting like topic. We see that nowadays like half of the I believe like I've seen like an article I think a few days ago that like half of the world's consumption, not consumption, but the world source of like energy comes from or electricity, I can't remember exactly, comes from solar panel. And that is very interesting to me because this is something that like people can to some extent like have on their own like, you know, land. If they, you know, you have like a house or whatever, you could like put some solar panels. And we have like seen like a kind of like a drop in price of like solar panels, I think in the last years as well. China is using like solar panels. We have talked about that like in deserts to kind of like feed electricity to entire cities and regions. So there are like structural changes that are very like useful and that will benefit like the individuals at a very like small scale. But of course, like this hinges on the fact that like your government is doing something for you to like put you in an environment where you can actually be like more environmentally friendly. And I think that's like a big issue nowadays, is that like most of the way we are living and the options like that are giving to you they don't allow you to be environmentally friendly. And people then are kind of like in a very jaded like mindset when it comes to like environment, because why would you like try to be like environmentally friendly, for example, if your city or if your country doesn't care about like recycling things, for example? You don't have like a good like systemic example you can like imitate in your, you know, personal life. And for pig meat, but pigs were a huge part in maintaining the cashew orchard my grandpa had. I'm on board the machine utopia when we have a robot that eats snail eggs and poop on the soil. What are we talking about? We are kind of bound by the current infrastructure into acting in a certain way. Exactly. I mean, you are bound by also like, you know, the global like chain supplies. We talk about that like quite a lot, I think, on this stream, because I think it's a very interesting topic when it comes to have a more like non-nationalistic like reading on things. But I think the crisis in West Asia right now is kind of highlighting that like your lifestyle is completely like dependent on a few specific like pieces of those like logistic chains, and that we are highlighting a dependence to like, you know, oil and gas right now. And countries that have a more balanced mix of like clean energy are suffering less from this particular crisis that we're living through right now. So always like very interesting to talk about. By the way, we have read literally nothing. Many intellectuals subsequently joined the chorus espousing the merits of meat eating and so on. So the Japanese has the smallest and worst physique in the world because they don't eat meat. By the 1880s, as the number of medical experts trained in the West increased, the intellectual promotion of meat and dairy gathered pace. Efforts were made to show that meat eating had long been a custom in Japan, as exemplified by the consumption of wild game. Ozawa Kenji, a physiologist, went as far as to pronounce that meat eating should be understood as a resurgence of ancient Japan. Okay, so what we have here, right, is what we call the invention of a tradition. This is like a kind of like sociology, anthropology term. That explains that like tradition is always something that is invented, as much as they are like kind of like beliefs or just behaviors, actions that were of course repeated in ancient times. The solidification of like those action into like a tradition is like always a product of like political policies, of specific policies, right? And be it like indirect or direct. And so there is this idea of like inventing a tradition, and that's what we see a lot when it comes to, you know, ideological like push here, like for the consumption of meat. We are inventing the fiction that like Japan was always eating meat because it like fills gaps in the theory to kind of like promote and justify like the consumption of meat in like this new modern westernized society. Many of the arguments were also couched in imperialistic terms. Intellectuals pointed that British might in India were a race of 3,500 meat eaters lorded over 250 million plant-eating Indians. Okay. So, you know, the superiority of like the meat eaters. In the case of China, its defeat in the Opium Wars was explained by the fact that the Chinese only ate pork and chicken, not beef. Okay, to become like the powerful British and to avoid the fate of weak Chinese, it was thus imperative to become beef eaters. Echoing these views, the Meiji government reformed legislation that had previously forbade the killing of domestic animals, promoted the consumption of meat, encouraged the importation of foreign livestock to develop stock breeding, and introduced canned meat, first in the Navy, then in the Army. So here, as you can see, we have this idea really of promoting like this invented tradition through like specific like policies that are going in that direction and that are like creating this narrative of always eating meat. Gotta head home, we'll be back in a bit. Be safe on your way back. So much of this official baking helped, it appears, to sweep aside any lingering religious reservation about the consumption of meat. One example of this occurred in Tsuruga Prefecture, located on the western seaboard and a region famous for being home to a sizable number of devout Buddhists. Following the establishment of a butcher shop in 1872, the inhabitants protested at the harmful effects of consumption of meat inflicted on body and soul, and took offense on how this practice offended the gods. So you can see here that like there's kind of like what we call a biopower to some extent. The fact that like a higher authority is kind of like changing, trying to police and to regulate like how people should behave on a biological level, on a physical level. And here it's like by the consumption of like meat. And hi, Jake, on the YouTube chat. Undoubtedly aware of a recent attempt by 5 Buddhist monks to forcibly enter the imperial palace in protest of the emperor's promotion of meat, the local government quickly stepped in to remind the inhabitants of the region that beef consumption improved people's health, and criticize how this unfounded superstition served to hold back the country's path towards civilization and enlightenment. So again, like a very like sharp criticism on actually how people are eating, like kind of like regulating physical behaviors. In the official government view, Buddhist qualms were considered secondary to the more pressing task of modernizing the nation. As such, objections to the eating of flesh based on religious grounds virtually disappeared by the end of the century. Unlike in present-day India, where religious vegetarianism carries major political clout, thanks to its promotion by the ruling BJP, a similar political movement based on Buddhist thinking failed to emerge in Japan. So again, that's literally what I was saying. You know that the BJP with Narendra Modi is like pushing a lot this narrative of like, you know, religious vegetarianism as like part of like the identity of India. And this is why it's such a big thing. You have like an ideological push at the highest level. While religious arguments against meat eating were ignored, scientific ones received more attention in the 80s. In fact, in contrast to China, which witnessed a conscious attempt to depart from Buddhist vegetarianism in favor of scientific vegetarianism as late as the early 20th century, Japan medical publications saw no need to refer to religion. One of the first people to express doubts, if not specifically about a meat-biased diet, then about the Western diet more generally, was the army surgeon Mori Rintaro. Celebrated more today for his work as a novelist writing under the name Mori Ogai than as the head of the medical division of the army ministry, Mori belonged to a generation of medical men sent to train in Germany who returned to spearhead the concept of hygienic modernity, first in Japan, then subsequently throughout its formal and informal empire. And that is like something that you will find like a lot in Japanese history, in modern Japanese history, this idea of like hygienic changes, modernity, that might or might not serve to either imitate the West in certain like policies, or to actually not imitate the West and go for like a more like Japanese solution when it comes to urban planning and such. So this idea like of hygienic modernity is always like a bit of a floating one, because you can like regroup a lot of different ideas in here. And of course the West has a very like specific influence, but you had like writers that had very specific like Japanese opinion on the subject. So most of the scientific and Western accounts upon which Japanese supporters of a Western diet based their claims viewed protein as the most important nutrient. This explains why meat, which contained the substance in abundance, pound for pound, it's the most like abundant source of protein. So meat was considered healthier as vegetables, which were believed to have less protein and be harder to digest. At the beginning of the 80s, the physiological consensus was thus that a largely vegetarian diet was insufficient to maintain health, and the weak Japanese body was commonly used as an example. And this is like, of course, a topic that you still have like nowadays, right? Because we have seen like an imbalance in like Western cultures of nutrients like beyond like protein. There's a lack of fiber, there's a lack of like magnesium, there's a lack of iron, a lack of vitamin in a lot of people's diet because of like hyper transformed food. And that's why like we are like, you know, rooting for a more like balanced diets between like meat or animal flesh and vegetables to find like a more like healthy combination for the human body. And that explains why like a lot of like, not all of them, but some like vegan people have to compensate like certain like nutrients because they don't get enough through non-animal products, and you have like a lot of meat eating or only carb eating people that are suffering from chronic like lack of vitamins and stuff because of their non-vegetable consumption of food. So Mori and some other people were skeptical, as Corina Traitel has recently shown. Kumagawa Muneo, a contemporary, became the first to openly challenge the protein-centric nutritional standard that the physiologist Carl von Voigt had laid down. Vegan protein is hard. I think it's like the problem, right? It's like, how do you compensate for it? Like, do you accept to eat like certain non-vegan like protein sources, or do you like get some alternatives through supplements and stuff? And it's always like there's always some sort of like, you know, individual like choice to make when it comes to like compensating for certain like nutrients. But it shows that like it's always a topic that is way more complicated than just ethics, in my opinion. Like we have to balance ethics, environment, you know, public healthiness and stuff. And it's always like a very interesting topic to explore. And that's why like food is always like political, because like we are trying to talk here about like sources of like nutrients in a very like broad sense, but it will like impact the way you're cooking things, and in turn like the type of like dishes you will find in like in every country. Vegan protein requires you to think about protein, while otherwise it's not something to worry about. But I think that's like also a problem in the sense that like people in general do not think enough about like their intake of like nutrients, proteins or not. And that is, in my opinion, like a failure of like public education to have kind of like discarded this idea out of our curriculum. And nowadays, like in most like Western countries, we are not teaching children how to eat healthily, especially when we are in a society that is pushing for the sake of like, you know, capitalism for hyper transformed like food as a way to make a lot of money. Okay. So Kumagawa demonstrated that not only were mixed and purely vegetarian Japanese diet perfectly nutritious, but that they also compared favorably to the European diet consisting of beef and pork. Returning from his own stint in Germany between 84 and 88, Mori took the same line. He launched a scathing attack on Kaneshiro Takaki, his counterpart in the Navy, for peddling the myth that the indigenous diet was deficient, and he showed that the average army diet consisting of rice, fish, tofu, and miso more than adequately met the standards of nutrition that Voigt advocated. In a series of experiments in which the daily food intake of army soldiers was analyzed, Mori discovered that soldiers consumed on average 111 grams of protein, 23 grams of fat, and 425 grams of starch, which compared remarkably well to basically the standards demanded by Voigt. It was thus shown that protein could be derived from a combination of grain, plants, and fish, and you can add meat if you want. But Mori did not stop just here. He wanted, and I think that's very interesting, because that's when things are getting very political, he went to reject the Eurocentrism of the nutritional standard, arguing that dietary recommendations failed to apply to Japanese bodies, which were smaller than the average European body. And that's kind of like put in questions also the different, when we see like, you know, nutritional like standards on the internet and stuff, it's always like standardized to kind of like the modern active Westerner man. And those standards are not the same, or at least those standards are like smoothing out a lot of very interesting like topics that we can talk about. Like your daily needs are not the same depending on like your work, on your physical activity. They are not the same depending on very specific like lifestyle choices. And there has been in medicine in general this idea that we are standardizing like bodies to a very specific type that is not representative. And that's why you have like things like people of color that are suffering from a lack of medical information on their bodies because research has not been conducted on their bodies. And I think a very good example, for example, is like the pain for Black people, because it is rooted in like prejudices and false presumptions on like what people of African descent and Black people could endure in their life. Also on the topic of like people of color and skin, you have like identification for like cancer that is way harder in average like nowadays, because most of like the techniques that were developed were made like for white people. And there are like gaps in our knowledge to how to treat or how to at least like engage in a more like professional way with people that are not fitting kind of like the westernized standard of patience right now. I think many would discover a lot about nutrition and their bodies if talking about poop would be more normalized. As much as this comment is kind of like a shitpost, I do agree. You have like a lot, and I think like you talk about this, but this is the same thing with sex education, right? A lot of people, through this idea of like puritanism, will refuse to talk about topics like sex education that can have like nothing to do with sex, by the way. You don't do sex education the same way with children and with adults. Sex education for children is more like relationship educations, and you would just like explain that like it's okay to be friend, you know, with boys and girls and like everybody in between. and that like there are like certain like, you know, behaviors that are okay to do in public and others that are not. You would say that like consent is a very important thing, by explaining, for example, that like if your friend wants to kiss you but like you don't want a kiss, then it's okay to say no, and that's like sex education. And I do believe that it's the same, that like what you're saying, that talking about like those topics like feces, poop, or whatever, it's also like kind of like helping like bring certain like topics on the table, to help like raise certain questions. I think like we talked again about like a few streams ago about like how clean our societies are nowadays, and I think that like this cleanliness came also to kind of like an abstraction of like what life is in certain domains. And for example, like one of the very example that is talking about like poop is really like weird to me is this idea that like using like toilet paper is hygienic, right? Because it's like the Western standard. Everybody is using like toilet paper to wipe their, you know, ass after like going to the toilet. And I think it's like very funny that in the other direction, the idea of like cleaning yourself by hand after going to the toilet is seen as something extremely dirty, when it's like objectively like cleaner, right? You're literally cleaning yourself with soap instead of just like wiping your poop everywhere on yourself and calling it like a day. And I think that like this kind of like revulsion like to poop to some extent, or at least this idea of like we cannot talk about this like in a serious way, is of course like a problem of our Western societies, and it is kind of like showing the bias that we have against like other cultures that are not doing the same thing as us. And for me, like the idea of like just washing yourself with like toilet paper and calling that like the cleanest way to do so is absolutely madness. Fighting colon cancer rates by talking about poop and eating beans. I mean, we can talk about everything. I think it's like kind of like the idea of this stream is that like we should be able to talk about everything, because it opens like windows on the world. Okay, so convinced that calories were more important than protein, Mori together with Kumagawa went further in demonstrating that a high carbohydrate and low protein diet could be just as healthy as the Western diet that boasted similar amounts of calories, because the value of the diet does not depend on the amount of protein, but the fixed amount of energy. Of course, you know, we have to nuance like Kumagawa and Mori's take on this, but like it shows that like Western science was not like perfect at that time either, with like this focus on like protein that was kind of like out of touch with like other ideas. Based on his experiments, Mori does cast doubt on the widespread notion that linked the recommended diet to the progress of civilization itself, claiming instead that the Japanese body, albeit small in size, matched the Western body in terms of muscle and strength, and suggested that there was no need to westernize the indigenous diet. Okay. Even though Mori's intervention centered on the problem of beriberi, a disease caused by the lack of vitamin B, and focused on soldiers, the wider implications for assessments of meat and vegetables and applications to broader society were apparent. His efforts helped undermine the central premise on which meat's healthfulness had been based and promoted. Mori himself felt that the meat-vegetable dichotomy was an unhelpful one. Both the Western and the Japanese diets were similar. Staples were grain-based, bread or rice, and the side dishes contained animal-derived foods, meat or fish, and vegetables, and he strongly felt that it was wrong to label foods as bad or good. It was more a matter of combining as many foods as possible to create the right nutritional balance. That's literally what we're talking about. For Mori, food were mere vessels to access the more important chemical components contained within them. The guises that they took were thus a red herring. And I think again, that is like the problem nowadays when we talk about like consumption of like meat, especially consumption about like meat and you know, like meat eaters being like very critical against like vegetarian and vegan people. You know that it's a political discourse, because what is like problematic for them is not that like it's healthier or not. The problem is more so that like we are attacking like their specific way of living, and that is like an identity attack. It becomes a cultural attack. And if we talk about like purely nutritional like ideas, be it like meat or something else, it doesn't matter, right? Like the consumption or not of meat becomes like purely identity based, environmentally based, and ethically based. Fighting colon cancer by eating red herrings. Tell me about this. So a more specific attack on the supposed superiority of a meat-based diet was launched by German physician and anthropologist Erwin Belz. Starting in 1976, he taught at the College of Tokyo Imperial University for close to 27 years, and is seen as one of the founding figures of Western medicine in the country. In 1901, Belz published his thoughts on vegetarian diet, the Japanese masses. He published his thought on the vegetarian diet that the Japanese masses followed in the pages of a German medical journal. He explained to his European readers that it was the scientific norm to believe that the Japanese diet lacked the necessary amount of protein and fat. However, like Mori, Belz was not convinced that Voigt's territory standard, which presupposed a larger European body, should be applied to the diminutive Japanese, whose industriousness was all too apparent in his day-to-day encounters with them. Very, very low vitamin B. Bell suspected that the largely plant-based diet that powered Japanese workers could be shown to have advantages, and to test his hypothesis, he invited 2 rickshaw drivers to participate in an experiment. Similar age, height, and experience for the first round of the experiment. Both were fed the same low-protein and high-carbohydrate meal. For the following 3 weeks, they were both asked to carry 80 kilograms of weight over a distance of 40 kilometers each day. As a result, the weight of one of the drivers increased a little, while that of the other driver stayed the same. For the second round of experiment, the diet of the same drivers were changed. They were fed meals that included beef, raising the amount of proteins at the expense of the carbohydrates. Both drivers expressed initial delight at the opportunity to devour what had evidently become a delicacy. However, just after 3 days, both drivers complained of fatigue, pleading with Belz to immediately stop his experiment. He complied and reported that after several weeks, the drivers were back to their former impressive selves. Supplementing his study with an anecdote about how a single rickshaw driver could cover the 110-kilometer journey from Tokyo to Nikko in almost as quickly as 6 separate horses, he concluded that a meat diet provides larger amounts of energy for the moment and for a short time, while the advantage of a near-vegetarian diet lies in stamina. Richie's Japanese scientist, accessible to the wider public several years later, and was elevated to folkloric status in the 20s and 30s. So here you still have like this invention of like tradition, right? By this idea that like it becomes like folklore. And thank you for being here, Hishi. Take care of yourself. Any brats in the chat? Where are my HoloLive watchers in the chat? So dietetic manuals and stuff. And you know, editors, like Japanese editors that were casting doubt on the notion that Japanese body lacked proteins and other necessary nutrients and so on. So I think here it's kind of like the same thing. We have like the same topic of like fighting against the protein doctrine in Europe. what is very interesting here is that like the nutritionist is characterized as a fanatic agitator and an agrarian anti-modernist, because again, like fighting against like, you know, the supremacy of meat is kind of like, again, a political topic that goes beyond just nutrition. He managed to show how wartime rationing had actually helped Danes to become healthier by just, I don't know, due to the fact that like 80% of pigs had been slaughtered to make way for the production of grains. The domestic population had made do by consuming more porridge, brown bread, and potatoes. And we kind of like talked about that when we had a look to the Danish food, right? About like the preponderance of like grain and carbs in their diet. Consumption of meat, pork, butter, margarine, and white bread had to be significantly reduced, pointing to a causal relationship between the strict diet Danes followed and the lowest mortality rate the country had ever experienced. Hindhede held the First World War as the healthiest period of the history of European health. That's a little bit of controversial statement, but it is what it is. Danish food, in brackets, in quotation marks, crazy work. So their work was significant to the Japanese context. Because foods such as fish, meat, eggs, and chicken were the preserve of the wealthy, which remained a smaller proportion of the population. And so the return to a simpler, more rural way of life, which remained a possibility because meat had not yet made major inroads. Okay, so that's also very interesting, like as again, political statement of like how we should organize society, and here kind of like refusing like the modernity, capitalism and stuff. We should like read like Hindhede a bit more to like understand how much like he was what was his exact gripes with like modernity, but I think it's very interesting. Okay, so socialism. And we'll go like a bit quickly on this because I think we have been yapping for almost like 2 hours. Socialists became interested in vegetarianism for distinctly different reasons. Back in 1988, the publisher Aoki Teizo had been the first to introduce Western vegetarianism to Japan, bringing out a pamphlet bearing the title Discussion about Simple Foods, Soshoku, that essentially summarized the chief arguments of the Vegetarian Society of England. The term Soshoku derived from the ancient Chinese term sushi, but apart from the word itself, the booklet belied very little Chinese influence, and the publication itself seems not to have made much of an impact. Reported on actual events and debates abroad as lived experience and considered whether Japan would follow suit. So Saishokushiki is now the accepted translation of the English word vegetarianism. Okay. Well, you know, Sai is vegetable. Shoku is like a diet food. And Shugi is doctrine. This is the best kind of stream, yet I haven't been able to focus on it at all. I'm sorry. There's the VOD, but like, you know, we'll do, I want to do like more streams like this, so you know, it's not the only time when we'll do things like this. So nobody embodied, okay, so that's the interesting thing, and also the person that you might have seen in the thumbnail of like this stream. Nobody embodied this change in Outlook more than Kotoku Shusui, who wrote about his encounter with vegetarianism in the United States in Kate Zaichi, a short-lived magazine whose aim was to implement socialist value through reform of the home. So, well, literally Kate is household, and Zaichi magazine. The vegetable dogma. I mean, okay, so very interesting here because we're talking about like Shusui, and I don't know how much like this article is talking about like Shusui. Shusui is like one of the most important like people in the history of like the left in Japan. So he went to the United States for a while, and he came back and brought back the idea that we need to like do a revolution to kind of like get rid of the capitalistic elite. So he was basically the person that kind of like radicalized the socialist, like the Japanese Socialist Party in Japan, and he is considered, broadly as the father of anarchism in Japan. So a very interesting figure here. And his method were, so he prôned not like electoral reformism, but he prôned like direct action as like a mean to like, reach like communism and the revolution. And part of like why he was like so extreme was also that he had been diagnosed with like a terminal disease, I can't remember which one, at the end of his life. And he felt that like he had nothing to lose, and that's why he could be like very outspoken and violent in his actions. And he was actually executed for having planned a bombing of like the Meiji Emperor Meiji in 1910, if my memory is correct. So like we are talking about like him for vegetarianism, but like he was like way more he was way more influent than just that. And I think like that's what like this article is saying a little bit. Had been arrested for publishing the first Japanese translation together with Sakai Toshiko of the Communist Manifesto in the socialist newspaper Heimin Shimbun, radicalized during his internment by the ideas of the Russian anarchist Kropotkin, that you probably know if you're interested in like anarchist history, especially with his book that was called The Conquest of Bread. So he was the translator of like Kropotkin that he met in the US, and he called that Kropotkin his like teacher, sensei, whatever. So Kotoku traveled to California and Chicago shortly after his release. Members of the American left and Russian dissidents whom he met influenced the foundation of his own Socialist Revolutionary Party. And what the article is not saying here also is that like before leaving America, he kind of like made also a revolutionary party in the US for like American Japanese people. So kind of like a crazy character, this Kotoku. And he's also aura maxing, like let me show you how this man is like aura farming. Kotoku Shusui. Look at him. Isn't he crazy? During his time in the United States, Kotoku was impressed by female socialists. I know that like even as an adjective, like it's okay to use female. I dislike the use of female in general. He was impressed by women socialists who had converted to vegetarianism. He reflected on his encounter with a Chicago housewife who had suffered from a weak physique and stomach-related illnesses. Since renouncing meat 15 years previously, however, she had not needed to return to the doctor once. His earlier impression that vegetarians lacked energy was obliterated by the boundless energy that Mrs. Merrill exuded. She opened a school in her home and taught classes from 9 to 10 in the evening, all while carrying out her household chores and going shopping in between classes without the help of a maid. This encounter prompted Kotoku to try out vegetarianism himself when he felt ill. He happily reported that after he stopped eating meat, his condition vastly improved. From his direct experience, Kotoku thus observed that meat-related products were difficult to digest, decayed easily, emitted toxins, and produced disease. Unless one has a strong stomach, he concluded, meat must be considered very dangerous. His conclusions were also informed by the view that meat merchants, as capitalists, had only their profits in mind. Butchers showed little concern about flogging diseased meat to unsuspecting customers. Renouncing meat was thus also about breaking ties with the market economy that had helped create this exploitation. So you can see that here we have like both kind of like nutritional concerns and more capitalistic like or economic concerns here about the state of like the food industry and the meat industry at that time. While it remains unclear whether Kotoku became a committed vegetarian, a close acquaintance of his, Kaneko Kiichi, an active socialist living in the United States, showed the way forward. More than his counterparts back in Japan, Kaneko took to heart the need to begin with socialism in the home, believing that reform started with changing the hierarchical relationship between husband and wife. And that is like a trend that we find a lot, of course, in socialism at that time. And that has disappeared a little bit nowadays, I think because of a very like almost like class reading of socialist like text that are kind of like missing the point of the household as like also the prime place of exploitation to some extent. So socialism in the home. For Kaneko, marriage was nothing less than a union of two equals, and upon marrying the American feminist Josephine Condra, he converted to vegetarianism as a consummation of this very principle. Kind of based. Even before their decision to become vegetarians, the couple was moved to boil less meat following the disclosures made by Upton Sinclair in his non-fiction novel, The Jungle, which caused a massive public outcry in the United States for exposing the exploitative, unsanitary, and inhuman practices of the meat packing industry in Chicago. If you do not know about The Jungle, I think it's a very interesting like early books on the topic, and it's still like a very interesting read nowadays because you will see like a lot of connections with our current like meat industry that is still fraught with the exact same like issues that like Sinclair kind of like presented in his book. So if you want some kind of like old school socialist like reading, I would advise you to read like The Jungle as like a very thematic like approach on the issue. More directly, the Kaneko Condras were moved to act following a conversation with a female teacher who, although harshly critical of the uncivilized practices involved in meat production, could not bring herself in abstain from meat for even a single day. Railing against her hypocrisy for just talking the talk, the Kaneko Condras resolved to become vegetarians themselves. In accordance with the vegetarianism of the day, the couple continued to eat eggs and dairy, but gradually turned the rest of their diet into one consisting of rice, bread, fruit, and vegetables. After just 2 weeks, Kaneko reported that they were able to go completely without meat. An unexpected surprise was a palpable improvement of their health. They also decided that they could not go without eating 3 times a day and reduced their diet to 2 meals with no adverse effects. Reflecting on his conversion, Kaneko waxly recalls, "I'm a believer that if society were to follow, as I did, a vegetarian diet and pursue 2 meals a day, that they would be able to bid farewell to all sorts of illnesses, making it possible for people to lead a healthy and pure life." Okay, so as much as like we have this idea of like, well, you just become like healthier when vegetarian, I think it's like more than like there was like a lack of like vegetables in their diet, and that like introducing like vegetables and kind of like being careful about like what they would consume, as like Ellie said before, by paying attention to like the mix of like nutrients in the food, allowed them to live like a healthier life versus like just eating meat. Again, I think that like we should not talk about and think in terms of a dichotomy between meat and vegetables, but more so kind of like find like a balance between the two, right? Breadfruit must be amazing. Oh my god, kind of based for that. I am leading a healthy and pure life. I mean, as long as you know you're healthy and happy, it's what matters. So for them, conversion to vegetarianism was more about just improving their health. That it was a form of protest against the elaborate arrangement by which food was prepared in wealthy households. So again, socialism in the home. Critical of the excessive practice in which an army of servants, cooks, butlers and maids would be employed to prepare meals for just 2 or 3 people, vegetarianism offered a way to end what they viewed as being tantamount to slavery. And that is also like a very good thing to kind of like, when we think about like Mediterranean diet, there's this idea of like eating just, fruits and vegetables and kind of like raw things, fish and stuff, very easy things to consume, very like low effort in terms of preparation. And that is actually also like a very good way to have like a very healthy diet. Like the idea, like if we were like to reduce like pollution when it comes to food, one of the best option without going completely like vegetarian or like vegan would be like to adopt a more like Mediterranean diet composed of like fruits, oil and fish. And nuts. I have to wonder how much of those effects are placebo as well, considering the expectations they apparently had towards vegetarianism. Even though I agree what you said about eating with more conscience, I think you are very right to say that, of course. I think obviously the article is not spending a lot of time on this topic or at all, to be fair, just because it's less about, I think, like the accuracy of like, the justification those people had for themselves, and more like what ideas that would like mobilize to convince like others, even if those ideas are wrong, right? We are at an ideological level more than like a very like pure scientific nutritional model. So I do agree that like part of it is like a little bit dubious, and their like justification is anyway like a little bit dubious, unscientific, but this like their focus was obviously on like breaking away from like this bourgeois way of living. So yes, I think as you say, it's a very interesting starting point versus like a more scientific like discussion. Placebo is absolutely magical until you're proven wrong. But I mean, placebo is also like, it's also like a tool that can be used like medically and productively. So it is what it is. So in contrast to Kotoku and Kaneko, Sakai Tochihiko, a major writer and figure in the socialist movement in Japan, added a moral argument to his pronouncement on why the eating of meat had to be rejected. In his passionate account describing his conversion to vegetarianism, Sakai saw the possibility for society and families to become kinder through the human treatment of animals. And here you can see that like we are finally reaching like the ethical argument in like the non-consumption of like meat. As a child, Sakai felt guilty when he joined his friends in beating a chicken with wooden swords, but given the general climate in which meat eating was being promoted, he could not bring himself to speak out. You cannot become strong without eating well, whether it be pigs or cows. The discourse is that eating meat is a must. Following his decision to become a member of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, however, Sakai became convinced that this wrong had to be put right. Such a humanitarian outlook was closely aligned with his socialist views. His call to renounce meat symbolized a larger concern with the development of capitalism, which he could not separate from the rise of a meat-based society, and obviously a rise of like a society where like humans were at the top of like the food chain and were considering like animals as like a pure source of like food that could be exploited, right? He pointed out advocates of competition, social Darwinists, and winners in life looked at how nature appeared to favor the survival of the fittest, exploiting this biological fact to justify the kind of behavior that created vast gaps between the rich and the poor. Common to them all was that capitalism involved the same species kicking, beating, and even killing one another. Socialism was about creating a society in which humans did not go after one another's throats. Why should interspecies relationship be any different? Socialism also needed to make efforts to hold in check the same mechanism that allowed the killing and beating of animals for the purpose of producing meat. And that is like a very specific way of like recentering, of like excentering, let's say, society out and environment out of like human people, and just like putting the human at the same rank of like other animals, like one, like we are just like one species amongst many others. And they are like very interesting like topics on that. Let me try to search for a very interesting book that is kind of like talking about it. Give me like 2 seconds so I can like actually find this like in my files. I think it's called Japanese Environmental Philosophy. So you have like this very specific book that is a very interesting book. And in here you have this article here, from Kyosei to Kyoe, Symbiotic Flourishing in Japanese Environmental Ethics. And basically the idea is that like, we won't read all of it because like it's a very long article and kind of like complicated, but this idea is that like mutual flourishing is that like humans should like cooperate with the other actors in the environment, so animals and stuff, as like a very like symbiotic relationship instead of like a hierarchical one where one dominates on the other, in a society where, against a society where like men would like dominate on others, other species. And he's like kind of like rooting for a more balanced relationship with the environment. So Jita Kyoe, togetherness or prosperity together, mutual flourishing, that I kind of like use also this concept that I'm using in my other on my research. So we might talk about that more at a later time. But again, you have this idea of like replacing like humans amongst like other animals. The main criticism emerged from the moral debate that Sakai helped instigate. First, critics struggled to fathom why animals should be included in the struggle for a socialist society. Humans themselves were still far from attaining equality or reigning in the excesses of capitalism. Why should concerns about animals be placed on an equal footing? Pushing the argument Sakai made to its logical conclusion, skeptics also wondered whether vegetables would also need moral consideration because plants could be seen to be alive as well. In response, Sakai accepted that the eventual inclusion of all animals was best left for the future, but remained adamant that as our sympathies developed, the principle should be extended from higher animals to low animals and then eventually to plants. So again, there's this idea that like it's difficult to make a very clear-cut line on like what we should like consider as like equals and what is not, is excluded from the discussion. And because it's impossible to draw such a line, we should have like just an understanding and an appreciation for all like the world that is surrounding us, and kind of like be aware of our place in the world without making everything gravitate around us. I think any message being tied to my name spoils the bunch. Don't worry about it, Ellie. Second, critics pointed out the contradictions inherent in vegetarianism. Referring to the guideline, they expressed surprise that animal-derived food such as eggs and dairy were allowed. What's the difference, they asked, between eating eggs and eating chicken, or between drinking milk and eating beef? In his defense, Sakai tried to show how a vegetarian diet was healthy. He also made use to the argument that monkeys, as humankind's closest relative, do not eat meat. He stressed that the development of a meat-based society contributed to increased violence, intimating that rising instances of aggression inflicted on animals strongly correlated with that perpetrated on humans. So kind of like a non-scientific like argument, but you can see the idea that like, you know, if we can like be that mean to animals, why would prevent us to be that mean to like humans? Kind of like the biopower that we kind of like discussed before. Refraining from the consumption of meat, he argued, would result in more peaceful people, kind of like a very broad like ideological statement, but I think it's like not that hard to kind of like grasp the idea that he had in mind. And also this specific like section here is obviously the whole like debate between like vegetarian diet and vegan diet that is still, you know, in question today. Finally, critics expressed doubts about the impact of this dietary advice on the working class, the very people whose plight the socialist movement aimed to alleviate. In the view of the physician Oishi Rokute, better known as Seinosuke, the scientific consensus was that a vegan diet, which Sakai seems to have been ultimately advocating, was insufficient to maintain health. What we just discussed like before, at least it's way more complicated to maintain like a healthy diet. That is why he explained Western vegetarians supplemented their diet with milk, eggs, butter, and cheese so as to absorb enough nutrients. Again, a false dichotomy between meat and vegetables. For Oishi, the dangers of romanticizing a diet based on vegetables was that it helped glorify the existing diet of the working class, who had to make do with cheap imported Nanjing rice and pickled leaves. There was no better way, he castigated Sakai, of keeping the working class hapless, impoverished, and downtrodden than to recommend from on high a vegetarian diet. And here you can see that like this particular section is kind of like talking about like chains of logistics again. If you can like have a healthy vegetarian diet coming from like local sources of food that you know are healthy and or abundant, then vegetarian diet is not problematic. But of course, we need to replace like those discourse in their context and in their, you know, a broader like historical like background, where of course people at that time were already not eating enough, as much as like as meat was seen as like the alpha and the omega. Many people probably, as was the case like in the past in Europe, in the West, were not able to eat meat at all because it was too expensive. And the idea of eating meat would be way more interesting if people weren't introduced to it at a young age and had to choose at an adult age. I completely agree. And for me, it's both like a failure of like school again as like a place to be able to learn about like those nutritional like concept and ideas, and it's also like the problem of having like super and hyper transformed food nowadays, and people have like no connections with like their environment and from like where your food is coming from. I think we talked about that, but like seeing like pre-cut food or pieces of like meat in supermarket, I think it's also like it's making people used to the fact that this piece of meat doesn't come from an animal to some extent. Most of the socialist debate into vegetarianism took place between 1905 and 1996, a heated period which witnessed the establishment of the first socialist party in the country. So also kind of like, and you can see here, it also bore witness to Kotoku's controversial decision to take direct action in toppling the government. So again, direct action, it means like attacking the government directly instead of like beating them in the urn, in the electoral urns. And what we mean by this is literally like, you know, bombing people, bombing like buildings, bombing like cars and stuff. That is direct action. Due to the increased state interference, the party was forced to dissolve in 2007, and the Heimin Shimbun had to close the same year. In 2009, Kanako suffering from tuberculosis, returned from the United States and died shortly afterwards. Kate Zaichi, which served as a main forum of debate, also folded in 2009. Both Kotoku and Oishi, viewed by the police as ringleaders in an attempt to assassinate the emperor, what we talked like a little bit before, were arrested in 10 for high treason and sentenced to death a year later. Sakai was spared the same fate as he had already been interned on charges relating to a different incident, but socialism as a political force was severely weakened. And the vegetarian ideals the movement espoused lost their power, along with the moral and humanitarian arguments that had been put forward. While it is impossible to know whether vegetarianism would have flourished in Japan had these figures lived on, their deaths certainly spelled the end of a vegetarianism that attempted to replicate the Western example. Okay. And then, oh my god, okay. We can try to like finish reading all of this. So this is like what is very interesting to me. This is the connection to like nationalism. What emerged instead was a more ominous reappraisal of the indigenous diet that resulted in the construction of a very different type of vegetarianism. Numerous wars were among the factors responsible for this shift. In particular, the Russo-Japanese Wars and the First World War, which were kind of like linked together to be fair, helped furnish, so it seemed, the hard evidence that had been lacking in the result driven from the clinical trials conducted by the likes of Belz, Komagawa and Mori. Following a Japanese victory in the Battle of Liueyang, the first major land battle of the Russo-Japanese War, the newspaper's Yomiuri Shimbun was quick to report on Bell's view that Japanese success could be attributed to the vegetarian diets on which the Japanese soldiers had been raised. So here you can see like very ideological, political and imperialistic justification for a vegetarian diet, which is not surprising because like the basically Japanese empire was also like very keen in doing like nature protection and conservationism by linking some like animals and plants to like the imperial regime, and kind of like fostering this idea that like those like species should be safeguarded. So there is like a very like ideologically informed type of like imperialism that was put forward in Japan in the early like 20th century, and that is something that like we should be aware of. Like a lot of like Japanese like parks have been built as part of like this like imperialistic like propaganda. I didn't know Hololive Yen was so based. That's crazy. That's actually crazy what you're saying. A few years after the conclusion of the hostilities, Kamimura Kensuke, a physician, surmised that the war had shown how Japanese soldiers, at least with regard to work and walking, could be regarded as superior to the Russians. He referred extensively to Bell's experiments involving rickshaw drivers as evidence that proved the Japanese working men, because they followed a natural vegetarian diet, were indefatigable. News about the First World War, during which the health of European soldiers were found not to deteriorate from the reduction of meat in their rations, served to further bolster the view that the nutritional importance of meat was an exaggeration. The extent to which the Russo-Japanese War shook the belief of intellectuals can be gleaned from the diaries of the literary scholar Uchigasaki Sakusaburo, who encountered an active vegetarian movement while studying at Oxford between 08 and 11. He tried his best to explain why the English were turning their backs on meat. He contended that this diary blipped hardly undid the progress that had been made over the centuries and warned his Japanese compatriots not to follow suit. As a country that still had a lot of catching up to do, the promotion of vegetarianism, at least at this stage of history, was tantamount to developmental suicide in his view. Uchigasaki was adamant that his nation's unexpected victory in the Russo-Japanese War had nothing to do with an indigenous vegetarian diet, but rather to turn back the clock to a vegetarian diet. He argued that it was important to continue to consume more meat. He recommended that the overall proportion of meat in the Japanese diet should be elevated to at least half. He also urged other Asian countries to follow suit. In his time as a student at Oxford, he took to task an Indian student who strongly believed in the benefits of a vegetarian diet. As long as Indians followed a plant-based diet, he warned, the country would never manage to become independent. Meat was for the colonizers, he quipped, while vegetables were for the colonized. But despite his protestations, dietetic publications continue to confirm the benefits of the near-vegetarian Japanese diet, in particular by showing how Japanese men possess stamina in abundance. Building on the work of Bells Sawamura Makoto, the most prolific writer on nutrition during this period, reassured his reader that while the Japanese body might look impressive, the Japanese had little to fear. Not only were they just as strong, but they also had great staying power. He referred to such carnivores as lions and tigers, whose ferocity as hunters was severely compromised by their pitifully low levels of endurance. Plant-eating prey, he suggested, managed to survive lengthy attacks because they had more stamina and so on. Okay, so we can see here that, like, you know, this entire, like, discourse here obviously is baked in a very, like, broad ideological propaganda, even because it's like related to war and to a certain idea of like what makes a nation, right? So there's this idea of like the superiority of like Japanese culture in general. Okay, Japanese stomach has a long pedigree, whatever, and so on. I don't even want to spend like too much time about it, but like, yeah, okay, so Japanese like body is different and they could like digest like plants better, but not meat as much. So by selecting the correct accompaniments, level of digestion could be improvised, so by eating less meat. And then, of course, it led to the impression that like Japanese foods were superior, which is like the central part of an imperialistic propaganda, of course. The roots of this realization can be traced as far back as to the socialist debate over how a vegetarian diet could be implemented. In the view of Oishi Rokute, the problem with following the Western vegetarian diet was the cost. The kinds of cereals, fruits, and vegetables that Western practitioners made use of were too expensive. So you know that, like, especially fruits are extremely like expensive in Japan. Eggs, olive oil, and milk were also hard to come by in Japan. Moreover, replicating the culinary techniques of the West was difficult. Based on these difficulties, Oishi advocated for the consumption of more domestic vegetarian meals that would be affordable, varied, and fit better into the country food culture. So you have like here a more like, you know, an awareness to like local context. And then like specific like techniques that were better at making like a vegetarian like meal package. So they say soy sauce, nimono, simmered dish, soup stock, grilled fish, pickled side, and so on. making Japanese vegetarian meal more nutritious. So he still like welcomed the introduction of Western food, but called for people to kind of like make use of their own culinary heritage. And I think like that's kind of okay, because like, so this is very interesting. We'll read this because this is interesting. So confidence in the ingredients used in Japanese cuisine soon extended to commentaries on the natural conditions in which plant-derived ingredients had to come into being. So basically the link with like environment, right? Here, how in comparison with Western countries, Japanese diet reflected more strongly the influence of climate and soil. Of course, this is like kind of like, you know, false idea. Because like Western food was also very linked to like terroir and like soil and climate. But at least he showed that Japanese food was like linked to a very specific like ecological conditions in Japan. So he proposed like his most the 5 grains, vegetable, fish, and game as like the basis of natural Japanese foods. Okay, so what is interesting is that like this discourse that is kind of like hearable in, you know, a very like people and environmentally focused like mindset has been shifted into, and that's what we see here, into a very nationalistic view of the domestic diet by saying that it is indeed like superior to every other diet, and that like Japanese culture is like the most advanced in the world for using like those culinary techniques and those ingredients and like those, you know, elements in nature. And that like Japan was made to be like the best country in the world because of its environment. Okay. In 32, Yomiuri Shimbun reported on the trip Egawa Tsuneo, a high-ranking army officer, made to Europe. Like many before him, he expressed surprise at the extent to which the vegetarian movement was making inroads on the continent. Struck by the connection the popular Western discourse drew between excessive levels of meat consumption and various diseases, he warned that Japan, while still free of the diseases linked with a meat-based society, could also tread a similar path if rushed too quickly to become like the West. Yet he remained optimistic. Japan could already hark back to a long history in which a plethora of vegetables, alongside seafood, had been put to use to foster the kind of mature vegetarian culture, Saishoku bunka. So here again, like vegetarian diet and bunka culture that would prevent his country from being afflicted by Western diseases. One major difference between Europe and Japan, as he perceived, was that Europe simply did not have a rich and sophisticated vegetarian culture to fall back on. The meals recently developed by European vegetarians tasted revolting, while the Japanese culinary techniques, which he described as the best in the world, had managed to render vegetarian meals more exquisite. Many of his ideas were erroneously assumed that Europe was a meat-centered civilization, were far from accurate. Nor could his definition of vegetarian be considered correct, especially when measured against Western standards. Rather, the significance of his opinions lies less in their accuracy and more in the fact that he did not feel the need to imitate the West in vegetarian matters. Because it was part of who the Japanese were all along. And that's part of their superiority, right? Such a view was echoed by Kimura Kaneaki, a nutritionist who published an article discussing vegetarianism in Dai-Asia, Greater Asia, a journal that embraced a pan-Asiatic ideal and sought to eliminate European imperial influences from the region. So, again, Japan or Asia first versus like European like colonizers, right? Espousing a negative view of the Westernization, of the Japanese diet, he repeated the main mantra about the adverse impact a meat-based diet could have on health, and so on. We talked about that before. In contrast, vegetables were free of toxin, better to digest, and so on. And he proclaimed that European scientists not consider the Japanese diet to be perfect. Research on stamina and so on. He demonstrated a strong connection between food and climate, or fudo, an expression that went beyond mere changes in weather conditions to encapsulate a cultural and spiritual condition. No other country, he went on to state, was blessed with as much nature or boasted as many types of vegetarian meals or possessed such a sophisticated culinary techniques. Again, an invention of like a perceived superiority of the Japanese diet, when of course in many other countries you had like very specific like cooking techniques that were used to produce very similar results. In Kimura's views, the recent Western turn toward vegetarianism indicated that what the Japanese had been practicing for millennia, concluding that Japan had little to learn from the West, including from its particular brand of vegetarianism. Kimura recommended a vegetable-centered diet supplemented by small amounts of disease-free fresh meat. So this is very interesting, like this part in this article, because I think that like it kind of like missed the nationalism part in here, in my opinion. Like you don't see that much how like all those writers were really like pushing vegetarianism, or at least like the Japanese brand of vegetarianism, as like an opposition to like Westernization. Like again, like in India right now, it's really meant to be a symbol like of superiority to not eat meat, because you will be part of like the better group. And to some extent, like this article is very focused on like, and it's not necessarily a problem, but very focused on like the nutritional aspect. And I think we're missing a little bit like of the ideological, political, imperialistic like discourse in here. In her recent work on history of vegetarianism, Angela Leung has observed how the country initially embraced vegetarianism in the early 20th century, only to turn against it in the late 20s. She has described how the vegetarianism espoused by the literati departed from traditional dietetic notions of sushi to embrace a Western nutritional reframing that focused on the toxins in the meat of sick animals. Benefiting from the scientific doubt casted on the health benefits of eating meat, Leung has demonstrated how socialists and political figures promoted a vegetarian diet that elevated the supposed superiority of Chinese cuisine as part of their nation-building efforts. Such movement resulted in the foundation of a vegetarian society, a culinary research center institute tasked with improving vegetarian meals, the opening of eateries and restaurants, especially in urban and cosmopolitan areas, and students pressuring Peking University to set up a vegetarian canteen, in which ingredients such as soy milk and bean curd took pride of place. By the late 20s, however, nationalist enthusiasm for a vegetarian diet, Leung argues, decreased as it became clear that the weakness of China lay in the backward vegetarian diet of the peasantry. For China to compete internationally, these deficiencies had to be reformed through industrialization and thereby set back the fortunes of vegetarianism for decades. And you can see here that like Leung is kind of like linking the pushback of like a vegetarian diet, or like the push for a meat-based like diet, to very like political reasons, nationalistic reasons. And that's kind of like what is missing in this demonstration here. Like I would have enjoyed learning how much like those this push like for vegetarianism was also backed by, you know, the central government. The Japanese encounter with vegetarianism bears witness to history in reverse. Unlike China, which began the early 20th century by lauding vegetarianism as an alternative path to modernity, Japan began promoting meat eating as the only way to the future from as early as the 70s because of like the Meiji like era and the opening to the West. In both cases, the influence of the Western science of nutrition was paramount. However, whereas the Japanese encountered a meat-centric international protein discourse in the 70s, the Chinese experienced a decidedly different nutritional discourse in the early 20th century, not least because Japanese researchers had by this time helped cast doubt on the nutritional merit of animal-derived food. So here they are saying that like Chinese had a different experience with nutritional discourse because the temporality is a little bit different. As the 20th century wore on, Japan gained confidence as an imperial power. The vegetarianism that emerged came to symbolize the superior health of the Japanese body, the sophistication of the country's food culture, and the uniqueness of the nature and climate in which its vegetables were cultivated. Given the nationalistic nature of Japanese vegetarianism, again, I wish we had like learned more about that. Neither vegetarianism nor the vegetarian diet came to mean the same or include the same ingredients as it did in the West. Fish, game, and even the meat of domesticated animals, as long as they were not central to the dishes, could be included in the meal because they were seen as part of the historic, natural, and indigenous diet. So that's the important thing. It's like there's an idea of like a pure food, a pure Japanese food. And that is interesting. That's like the very interesting part for me, is how you relate like the consumption, of animal meat, right? Into like what is essentially like vegetarian. And alas, like this article did not like explain that much about it, like on ideological like terms. Like we had like a lot of discussions of nutrition, but I wish like we had a little bit more in terms of like of ideology, of like political ideology. What is equally remarkable is how in both China and Japan, political influences sway the fortunes of vegetarianism. In both countries, socialists and anarchists were heavily involved in the promotion of vegetarianism. In contrast to China, which witnessed the emergence of eateries and societies, Japan's socialist interest in vegetarianism did not go beyond the promise that it held as an anti-capitalistic ideology, not least because the main promoters had little opportunity to develop its principles. And also we said earlier that it was like socialism at home, right? Crucial to the fortune was the involvement of the state. Okay, so they're kind of like explaining it, but like without explaining it, right? I think what is very interesting, like here, what they are saying here, so government suspension of the socialist movement in Japan would not have likely endangered, would not have likely endeared vegetarianism to officials, and the state continued to encourage the production and consumption of meat, with Korea and China becoming major supplier of cheap meat as the empire expanded to East Asia. So what is very interesting in here for me is that like we need to oppose two things, right? We need to oppose the socialist vegetarianism to kind of like a nationalist, historical, traditional vegetarian diet. Because this one this one here is really like a product of sorry, the state. Such a sustained interest in vegetarianism and the vegetarian diet during the period under review also complicates the predominant narrative of meat's ascent in pre-war Japan. It helps to explain in part the sluggish take-up of meat in the Taishō and early Showa periods. What this chapter also reclaims is a past that has hitherto remained hidden in contemporary discussions of vegetarianism in Japan. No longer can Buddhist traditions continue to be touted as the sole example of vegetarian Japan. It must now take into consideration the socialist and the scientific vegetarianism espoused in the early 20th century. Ultimately, vegetarianism as a concept appears weakly or poorly understood in Japan, at least partly because its tenets were influenced by a nationalism that saw its own historic and cultural vegetarian diet. Again, like it's like I really want to believe that idea, but I just don't have like any clear-cut example in here that showed me that like the state was like pushing for this, you know, beyond like kind of like what they said like a little bit here is that like articles in like magazines and like newspapers are not enough to extrapolate like an official policy. So I'm very like cautious about like calling that like a vegetarian nationalism without seeing like any form of like official push from like politicians for this, being politicians in power or not. So I do agree that like there's like an invention of a tradition and that's like completely fair. But we need like a more like specific examples. So if anything, this article I think is more so like opening interesting like forays of like investigations in the future. It's like we need to perhaps look at like other sources, official like sources in the archives and stuff, to kind of like have a better idea of the official stance on vegetarianism. Was it like used in political discourse, and how official people would make a link between like a diet and like the, you know, regional superiority of Japan in the Pacific versus like other states, because that's kind of like the point of imperialism. It's also showing that like the dominant culture of like the metropole, so here Japan, is better than you know, the culture in China, the culture in Korea, the culture in the in Taiwan, in the Philippines. So I think like half of like demonstration has been made here. It's like more so like an open door to explore than something else. So that's basically what we have learned today. I think we have seen that like there were sorry, early discourse that were going against like the rise of like meat in Japan. We saw that like there has been a push like for meat in Japan as part of like a westernized like modernization, but like medical studies and experiments has shown in here that like maybe we need like to reconsider like the benefits of like this like protein-based diet that were missing like other nutrients. We have seen that like for socialists, the vegetarian diet was meant as like an ideal that was fighting, or at least like opposing the hierarchical structure of society, both at home and like on a macro level. At home because of like the way people would spend a lot of time preparing food, whereas in a macro level, we see that the exploitation of like animals and also the way we are selling cheap meat to people is also conducive to this class-based society where poor people are more likely to be sick because they are given like very poor cuts of meat. And as much as like this discourse was like brought to Japan, we have seen that like the demise of like most of those like socialist leaders and thinkers have basically brought to an end this very socialist approach to diet, to food, and to vegetarianism. And so then there's the question of like a national the invention of like a national vegetarian diet as like a pseudo historical like topic for the central power as to push like the superiority of the Japanese people, the Japanese culture over the other its neighbors in the Pacific, but also against like the West, as Japan tried to join like the concert of nations worldwide. I'm still, as I said, like very unclear about like the demonstration in this last part. I think we are missing clear information to really talk about vegetarian nationalism, but I'm very willing to accept this idea because again we have seen like very similar phenomena in other countries. We talked about like India, the BJP, and Narendra Modi's push for a very vegetarian society as to oppose Hindu, like the Hindi culture, to like the Muslim culture that is eating meat, and to show that like they are outcast in a society that do not accept their way of living. That's for me the point of like vegetarian nationalism. It's really to show that like certain cultures are less important, less like civilized than others, and we haven't seen that completely, I think, in this last part of the demonstration. But at the very least, we have seen that like there has been different types of like vegetarianism, or vegetarian diets. A socialist one, born of the thinking of like socialist thinkers and scholars. We have like a more traditional pseudo historical like object that is part of like ideological like currents for imperialism, and we have seen also like and especially I think like this could be also linked to like state Shinto that was also developing at that time, before like with the rise like to the Second World War. And there has been like also like on the side like a more like Buddhist vegetarian diet, although this article, sorry, is not talking that much about it. And I think that's pretty good. We have shown, at least in this article, I believe that like food is indeed political, and that like it serves like its consumption, its production, and the discourse around it serves to fuel like different type of like ideas, of political ideas, and is kind of like a proposition to how we do manage our society, and the ideal like structure that we want to have. And that is shown through like the choice of ingredients, but like as it was like mentioned a little bit above, I don't remember when, is that like techniques also were part of like these comparisons. And you have like this idea that like cuisine and specific dishes, specific like techniques are born from like as is said here, from food, or from a connection with like the environment, with the broadest like historical context, and that it's always like moving, that in a way trying to like solidify and petrify a very specific like diet into something that will not move is like a very political choice that is always linked to some kind of like nationalism, because food, through this modest connection, interaction with like other cultures, will move, and that's why like you have like so much like Creole foods and yeah, frontier uh, or borders in general, because that's where like the interactions between like foods are the most numerous, and that's why also like migrants are very like powerful vectors of transmission and transformation of diet, especially in our globalized society. I don't know what I'm talking about. Thank you very much. And we can do a doll. And we'll leave on that. So, would people prefer roast chicken with chips or the Baiji burgers? You know what? I don't exactly know here. I think like the left one is more appetizing, but I might underestimate like how people, why, I mean, it's also super expensive compared like to the burger. But this is a bonus round. I think it doesn't count. I think bonus round is like, which one do you prefer? I think my problem with like those is that like the fries are obviously frozen. And I think it's like a little bit expensive for that. And I don't know, outside I don't like eating burgers at all. So I personally would go like for the chicken, but okay. Can we have anything else than like fast food also? So a full hog burger, beef patty, bacon, sausages, and cheese, or a cheese steak? I'm expecting people to go with burger in general, in my opinion. Glossy top bun equal win, I guess. That's crazy. I'm not much of a shiny, glossy top bun person, to be fair. Okay, full hog, good. What the f- No, okay, so we know that it's the one on the right, but like, what is this? A kebab? What the heck is this? There's no way people won't go for the burger, but this one doesn't look very good because I think like what are those like bacon like? This is not even a slice. This is what the heck? I don't even want to know. I don't even want to talk about like the kebab or whatever that was. I don't know. I don't think it looks that good like this one. The burger looks so bad. Yeah. Like I would go like for the pie, I guess. And like the inside, the filling doesn't look that bad, but I think I don't know. Yeah, people are still choosing like, the thing is like people will always choose burgers even if they look like disgusting. I mean, I don't have like problem with like mince pie, even like you can mix apple, but the fact that like you're eating like in a cup, that's like crazy for me. Double cheese bacon burger. I mean, this one looks okay. This one looks okay. So you know what? With custard, what the heck? Okay, but we have a souvlaki like on the right, so like it should win. But again, I'm expecting people to go with like the kind of like sliders, 2 pies, chicken strips, cheese bites, mozza sticks, 2 drinks, and a program, whatever. But I would go with like the souvlaki, to be fair. Because like the fries are also like made in house, right? You can see like the skin in here. And it's like a little bit more healthy. Yeah, you have a little bit of green. I think like it's too. I can't eat that. Like it's too meaty. It's too like greasy. Hi, yeah. What the heck? Okay, your thing looks disgusting because even like your slice of cheese hasn't melted, by the way. But like, what is this? Anti-meat TV. We are back in the vegetarian like discourse. No, this looks crazy. This looks crazy. You can't drown things in gravy like this, please. It's okay, so I don't know the ice cream sandwich game, the ice cream sandwich meta. I never had it. What the heck? What do you mean pie in a donut? I mean, ice cream sandwich cannot be bad, right? It's literally ice cream and some bread, which is like cream and bread. Like I could vibe with this. But what is that? What do we mean by pie in a donut? What is this like darkish feeling in here? A pie with what inside? I don't want to know. Okay, no, okay. The bun is green. The bun is green. So this is like Brazil, by the way. So you have to explain that to us, like Sky. Also, what is this? What is this drink? Green beer. This is here. Well, that's Brazil, so you know. I mean, you would really eat like a cottage pie, like on a. I mean, I don't mind like a cottage pie, but on a football match, vegan burger. I'm not sure it's vegan. Like it looks like a smash burger. I've never seen such an atrocity in my entire like. Arguably, it's just like food coloring, right? So it's probably just for a thematic thingy, but. This is the same price though. I think people would go with like a cheeseburger anyway. Yeah, it's friendly restaurant, right? Oh my god, people are weirded out by the green bun. Very interesting. Curry cheese and chips. What the heck? Fish and chips with fried halloumi and curry sauce. It's not the worst looking curry sauce. The fish, it looks, you know, what it is. Yeah, the green beer, I think, was really the weird thing. I drink a naturally green beer, but not one that looks like uranium juice. Exactly. Oh, that's expensive also, like €14 for like fish and chips for literally nothing. I understand that we're like at a football match, so everything is like inflated, but I think for me it's really like this idea of like having your sauce just like on top like this. It looks like disgusting to me because like you're literally like drowning the fries in like the sauce. And also I don't get the idea of like the very specific like UK curry sauce. That's like very weird to me because it tastes nothing like, you know, curry sauce, a traditional quote unquote traditional curry sauce. I don't know. Exactly. Like I would go with the fish and chip. Probably, like at least it's a little bit cleaner. Okay. No, but I don't know what is worse to be fair, because on the right it's like literally like a sausage, some ketchup, and just like 3 slices or 2 slices of like weird sourdough bread. How do you even get to that point? How does that happen? Bread slice and sausage are a staple dinner. I do agree. No, I think it's like definitely spicy sausage, but like, what happened to this? What happened to this? That's crazy. That's crazy. Okay, let's do like the food guesser and then we can like wrap it for today. Pork, veal, pork fat, ice, salt, white pepper, mace, ginger, cardamom, optional beef, coriander, lemon powder, saffron. This dish is a mild, unsmoked sausage known for its perfectly smooth, finely ground texture. It is easily recognized by its distinctive, bright yellow outer casing, which was originally colored using saffron. Made from pork and veal spiced lightly with mace, ginger, and cardamom, it is especially popular with children and is typically enjoyed thinly sliced as a cold cut on fresh bread. It's weird because it brings me in very like different directions. Like, I would have guessed like Central or Northern Europe from the picture, but I'm getting like thrown off by the spices. Because the spices kind of like give me a West Asia. No, or it can be saffron though? Southeast Asia was like a possibility, but like the saffron is a little bit weird to me. Like right now I would go Turkey, but pork and veal. So no, not Turkey then. It has pork though. Is it like Central or Northern Europe? Lightly spiced. I'll go. I want to go Germany for some reason. Oh, Gelbwurst. Originated from Bavaria, first created in the 19th century, which translates to yellow. Oh, the color of the casing resembles saffron, although it does not actually contain the spice. So you're just like, you're lying to me. Yeah, okay. Lamb or chicken, pasilla chili, Guayos chili, garlic, avocado leaves, onion vinegar, bay leaves, salt, pepper, cumin, thyme, marjoram, banana leaves, or parchment paper, lemon juice. No. I mean, it looks. I would say like Mexican, but. Bavaria derogatory. That looks like. This dish features tender, slow-cooked meat, often mutton, rabbit, or chicken. Rabbit? Marinated in its rich paste of dried chilies and spice. The seasoned meat is tightly wrapped in the translucent parchment-like outer skin of agave leaves, then gently steamed or peat roasted until fall apart tender. Peat roasted, though. Peat roasted gives like yeah, banana leaves is like is the biggest tell, I think. The chili like combination as well, but like I would go Mexico. I think like peat roasted looks like is like very Latin American. Agave and like banana leaves as well, and you have like a little, I don't know. Because the mutton, rabbit, or chicken, which is kind of like also, you know, Spanish influences like a lot, right? And there it is. Michiote, I don't know how you pronounce that. Hidalgo in Mexico, cooking technique. A thin layer of mangy plant traditionally used to wrap the food. Okay, okay. Ooh, what are we looking at? Pumpkin, coconut milk, sugar, egg, salt, vanilla extract, pandan leaves. Okay, pandan leaves is kind of like the tell. Like it looks, well, pumpkin. Pumpkin is weird. This dish features a delightful blend of creamy coconut milk and luscious pumpkin. It's a unique dessert with a whole pumpkin hollowed out, filled with a custard mixture of eggs, sugar, and coconut milk, then steamed until the custard sets. The rich, smooth texture and the subtle sweetness of the pumpkin complement the fragrant coconut, creating an exquisite and satisfying treat. It looks very good. Like I think it's like because pumpkin is like is very sweet, like in itself, right? Banana leaves is interesting. Because it cannot. I was pumpkin is weird though. I was thinking like I think the custard and the coconut milk feels like very. It felt very Asian, but I think I'm probably mistaken because of the pumpkin, and I don't see like pumpkin kind of like being used here as like the main. The main element of like of that dish, I think. Or can it be though? It really gives like Asian vibes though. Like the custard with coconut milk. It can't be Denmark, it has spices. That's crazy. Slender on my channel, on my chat. the custard is really throwing me off. Pandan leaves is no. Pandan leaves, it has to be like Southeast Asia though. But what like Southeast Asian country would use like pumpkin as like their the main ingredient for a dessert? Okay, let's think about history, right? I mean, the entire continent was like, well, the entire region was like colonized by the French, so I guess it could make sense though. Vietnam? I'm not against Vietnam. It borders. Wait, it borders Vietnam? It's I never had that in my entire life. I never had that in my entire life. I've never had that. I never had like anyone told me about like that dish in my entire life. Some version use taro, sweet potato, or pandan for color and taste. So Japanese pumpkins. So okay, so the custard, of course, was like, yeah, felt very like Portuguese, Spanish, whatever. Sankaya facton. Sankaya la poivre. I don't know. Literally everyone but Vietnam. For some reason. Okay. I'm a bit intrigued in here. Oh, that wasn't too bad, I think. Some people had it in one, but I mean, I think like if you play this every day, you kind of like see a lot of very similar food, so it's quite like easy to get very good at like this game, in my opinion. Okay, that's it for today. I think we talked about food like a lot. I want next time that we read something about food to have like something a bit more specific. I want to take a look at like one specific like meal or like types of meal or dish to kind of like talk about that. I have like many interesting like articles that I want to read. We can or even reread. There's like this very interesting. Let me try to find it. There is like a very interesting chapter in here. There. About the like biwa and also the cooking around like biwa, and I was using that a little bit in my videos, I think. But I want to take a look at like, you know, the actual type of like food that like we're eating here, and I think it could be very interesting to highlight specific Japanese food that people don't really know about. So we might do that like at a later point. But for now, thank you for being here today in this like very yappy session of like me, you know, reading and like yapping about things. I hope that it was at least a bit entertaining and that, you know, you took like some ideas for yourself. I will see you on Wednesday for Chance of Senna. We'll play a little bit the game, but I also want to yap, so we'll see what we'll do. For now, take care of yourself. And I'll just... No, that's it. No, that's it. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time. Take care of yourself. Bye bye. Gave a lot of food for thought. +2.